In the spring of 1873, neighbors in rural Kansas noticed something odd. The Bender family's inn had gone quiet. No smoke from the chimney, no travelers stopping by. The small building sat empty on the prairie, doors swinging open in the wind. When the neighbors finally worked up the courage to investigate, they found a trap door in the floor, bloodstains on the floorboards, and in the vegetable garden behind the house, 11 bodies buried in shallow graves. The Benders were gone. They had vanished into the Wild West, leaving behind one of the most disturbing crime scenes in American history. This is the story of the Bloody Benders, America's first family of serial killers. The year was 1870. Kansas was frontier territory, barely civilized. The Civil War had ended just 5 years earlier, and the West was filled with drifters, outlaws, and people running from their pasts. There were no photographs posted in town squares, no wanted posters that actually looked like the criminals they depicted, no telegraph lines connecting every settlement. If you wanted to vanish, you simply walked into the endless prairie and became someone else. It was easy to disappear into the vast emptiness of the frontier, and it was even easier to make someone else disappear. The Osage Trail wasn't much of a road, more like a worn path through the tall grass prairie, marked by wagon ruts and the occasional milestone. But it was a lifeline, connecting settlements and carrying an endless stream of travelers, settlers heading west with everything they owned packed in wagons, businessmen traveling between towns, drifters looking for work. All of them were potential customers. All of them were potential victims. It was along this trail, about 50 miles from the town of Independence, that a family arrived and built a small inn. They called themselves the Benders. There were 4 of them. John Bender Sr., a man in his 60s with a thick German accent and a mean disposition. His wife, Elvira, who called herself a spiritualist and claimed she could heal the sick and speak to the dead. Their son, John Jr., a hulking man who rarely spoke. And their daughter, Kate. Kate Bender was 23 years old, striking and charismatic. She gave lectures on spiritualism in nearby towns, advertising herself as Professor Miss Katie Bender and claiming powers of clairvoyance. She drew crowds. Men came from miles around to see the beautiful young psychic perform her seances. But the real business was the inn. It was a simple structure, a single large room divided by a canvas curtain. On one side was a crude grocery store with shelves of supplies. On the other side was a dining area with a single table and a few chairs. Travelers on the Osage Trail would stop for a meal, maybe buy some supplies, and continue on their way. Or at least, that was the idea. The Benders positioned the guest of honor's chair with its back to the canvas curtain. This wasn't unusual. There were only so many ways to arrange furniture in such a small space. What the traveler couldn't see was what was behind that curtain. In the floor, hidden beneath the fabric, was a trap door leading to a small cellar. The system was simple and efficient. Kate would charm the guest, keeping them distracted with conversation and her magnetic personality. Ma Bender would serve food, and behind the canvas curtain, Pa or John Jr. would wait with a hammer. When the moment was right, a heavy blow would come through the curtain, striking the unsuspecting guest in the back of the head. The impact would send them forward, and they would fall through the trap door into the cellar below. If they weren't dead from the hammer blow, their throat would be cut. Then the body would be stripped of valuables, and after dark, buried in the garden. For 3 years this went on. Travelers disappeared along the Osage Trail. Some were found murdered, their bodies dumped in creeks or left in ditches. But most simply vanished without a trace. The Kansas plains swallowed people. Disease, accidents, outlaws, wild animals. Death was common on the frontier. Families back east waited for letters that never came. Most assumed their loved ones had died somewhere along the trail and would never know exactly where or how. The Benders counted on this. Every body they buried was just another disappeared traveler in a land where people disappeared all the time. In 1872, a man named William York traveled through Kansas searching for his missing brother. Dr. George York had disappeared months earlier while traveling the Osage Trail. William, who happened to be a powerful politician and former Army colonel, was determined to find out what had happened. His investigation led him to the Bender Inn. He stopped there, asked questions, and then continued on his way. A few days later, William York himself vanished. This was a mistake. William York wasn't a nobody. His brother, Colonel Alexander York, was even more prominent and influential. When William disappeared, the colonel personally organized a massive search party. Over 50 men combed the area, questioning every settler and searching every property along the Osage Trail. In early April 1873, the search party came to the Bender property. Kate Bender, as charming as ever, welcomed them. She offered them food and spoke enthusiastically about spiritualism. She was so convincing, so normal, that the search party almost moved on. But something bothered Colonel York: the crude living conditions, the strange layout of the building, the way John Jr. wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. York told the Benders they would be conducting a thorough search of every property in the township, including theirs, and would return within the week. The Benders assured him they would cooperate fully. 3 days later, a neighbor noticed that the Bender property had been abandoned. The livestock were gone. The building was empty. The family had fled in the night. The neighbor alerted the authorities, and on April 18th, 1873, a group of men entered the Bender property to investigate. What they found would shock even hardened frontiermen who had seen their share of violence. The trap door was immediately obvious once you knew to look for it. The floorboards around it were stained dark, not the weathering of age, but something else. Behind the canvas curtain, the wall bore spatters of what was clearly blood, arcing upward in a pattern that told its own grim story. In the cellar below, which was really nothing more than a crawl space, the earth was saturated. The smell was overwhelming. Tools used for the murders were found discarded around the property. Hammers with suspicious stains, knives that had clearly been used for more than cutting rope. Then someone suggested they dig in the garden. The vegetable patch behind the house where the Benders had grown beans and corn and potatoes in neat rows. The earth there looked disturbed in places, settled differently than it should. The first body was Dr. William York, then his brother George. Then more and more. Some were so decomposed they could barely be identified. Others showed signs of having been tortured before death. At least one victim was a young girl, no more than 8 years old, who had been buried alive next to her father's body. 11 confirmed bodies. Some estimates put the real number at 21 or higher. The brutality of what had happened at the Bender Inn spread across the country like wildfire. Newspapers from New York to San Francisco ran stories about the Inn of Death and the bloody Benders. The fact that an entire family had been involved, that Kate Bender, beautiful and cultured, had helped lure men to their deaths, made the story even more sensational. But the Benders themselves were nowhere to be found. The largest manhunt in Kansas history was launched. Thousands of vigilantes and bounty hunters scoured the frontier. Every train depot was watched. Every boarding house was searched. Descriptions of the Benders were sent by telegraph to every town with a wire. A reward of $1,000, an enormous sum at the time, enough to buy a good farm, was offered for information leading to their capture. Reported sightings came from everywhere. A woman matching Kate's description was seen boarding a train in Dodge City. A man resembling John Sr. was spotted in a saloon in Texas. Someone swore they'd seen the entire family on a steamboat heading south. None proved credible. For every real lead, there were a dozen false ones from people chasing the reward money. The problem was simple. In 1873, there was no way to conclusively identify someone. No photographs of the Benders existed. Descriptions varied wildly depending on who you asked. Kate was beautiful or plain. Pa Bender had a thick accent or spoke perfect English. Without fingerprints or any scientific method of identification, you had to take someone's word that the person arrested in Michigan was actually Kate Bender. And she could simply deny it, which is exactly what happened. The prevailing theory was that the family had split up and fled in different directions. Kate, with her charm and education, could easily blend into society in a city. The men could disappear into the rough labor forces of the West. Ma Bender could claim to be a widow and settle quietly somewhere remote. But there was another theory, whispered in Kansas taverns and never officially confirmed. Some believed that vigilantes had caught the Benders within days of their escape, that frontier justice had been swift and final, and that the bodies had been disposed of quietly to avoid the spectacle of a trial that would bring more attention to the territory. Several men later claimed to have been part of the group that caught and killed the Benders. They told stories in saloons, usually after a few drinks. The details varied, but the core story was the same. They'd tracked the family down, and the Benders had met the same fate they'd given their victims. No bodies were ever found, no proof was ever offered. But the rumors persisted. If you're enjoying this dive into the darkest corners of the Wild West, please hit the like button and subscribe to The Crime Historian. It helps us bring you more forgotten cases from America's past. Years later, stories emerged. A woman claiming to be Kate Bender was arrested in Michigan. She denied everything and was eventually released. Rumors spread that the Benders had been seen in Texas, in Mexico, even back in Germany. None were ever confirmed. The truth is that the bloody Benders simply vanished into the vast American frontier. In an era before photographs were common, before fingerprints, before any real system of tracking criminals across state lines, it was entirely possible to disappear and start over with a new name. The Bender property became a dark tourist attraction almost immediately. Thousands of people visited the site, taking pieces of the building as souvenirs. The structure was eventually dismantled and the land sold. Today, nothing remains except a historical marker on a lonely stretch of Kansas highway. But the questions remain. How did an entire family decide to go into the business of murder? Was it Pa Bender's idea or Kate's? Did they start with robbery and escalate to killing, or was murder always the plan? And how did they live with themselves, going about their daily lives while bodies decomposed beneath their garden? Kate Bender is perhaps the most fascinating figure in the story. By all accounts, she was intelligent, educated, and charismatic. She could have made a legitimate living as a spiritualist or teacher. Instead, she chose to use her charm to lure men to their deaths. Some historians believe she was the true mastermind of the operation, using her father and brother as muscle, while she played the role of bait. The evidence supports this theory. Kate was the one who drew people to the inn with her spiritualism lectures. She was the one who kept guests distracted and comfortable while they sat in the killing chair. And when Colonel York came asking questions, it was Kate who charmed the search party and nearly convinced them to move on. After the murders, she would have been the easiest to hide. Pa and John, with their rough appearance and limited social skills, would have stood out anywhere they went. But Kate? She could walk into any city, claim to be a widow or a school teacher, and disappear into normal society. If anyone recognized her, she could simply deny it. Without photographs or fingerprints, who could prove otherwise? The Bloody Benders case marked a turning point in how Americans thought about crime. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This was premeditated, systematic murder as a business model. A family working together to kill strangers for profit. It was a level of calculated evil that shocked even a frontier society accustomed to violence. And they got away with it. Unlike most criminals in the Wild West who met their end at the hands of lawmen or lynch mobs, the Benders simply walked away from their crimes and disappeared. Whether they lived out their lives in hiding, started over with new identities, or met their end at the hands of vigilantes, we'll never know. What we do know is that somewhere in the vast American West of the 1870s, 4 people who had committed at least 11 murders went about their lives, carrying the secret of what they'd done. Maybe they stayed together, maybe they split up, maybe they felt remorse, maybe they felt nothing at all. The trap door is gone, the inn is gone. The garden where bodies were buried has long since returned to prairie grass. But the story of the Bloody Benders endures as one of the most chilling chapters in the history of the American frontier. A reminder that in the lawless West, evil didn't always ride into town with guns blazing. Sometimes it smiled at you from across a dinner table, asked how you took your coffee, and struck when your back was turned. The Bloody Benders vanished over 150 years ago. Do you think they escaped and lived out their lives in hiding? Or did vigilante justice catch up with them in the wilderness? What about Kate? Could an educated, charismatic woman really orchestrate something this brutal? Let me know your theory in the comments. If you want to hear more stories from the darkest corners of American history, subscribe to The Crime Historian. Next week, we're covering another case that shows how evil can hide in plain sight. Until then, remember, the past is never truly buried. I'm the Crime Historian, and I'll see you in the archives.